Mindset Podcast,
where we share things of interest to us and hopefully to you.
So let's get started with episode number 79. And this week, it's Terri's turn to share something. So what have you been listening to this week, Terri, that you found interesting?
Well, Daisy, for me, it's often variations on a theme. And I listened to an episode of the Jordan Harbinger show. And this episode is with Charles Duhigg, and he is the author of the book, The Power of Habit, another book that I have not read, but The Power of Habit is a really good book. So I thought, well, this would be interesting. And it's really talking about some themes that you and I have talked about before, about motivation and how to get things done. The title of it is called The Secret of Being Smarter, Faster, Better. Not sure that that's what I took away from it, but I think I took away some important tips. So I'd like to share those.
Can't wait.
So in talking about how to be more productive, more successful, more efficient, first, Charles Duhigg talked about using contemplative routines, and that those people who tend to produce more and achieve more create some contemplative routines. And by this, he's describing habits that get you to think about things a little more. Not obsessive thinking or not ruminating about things, but more think about information that you have and how you're going to apply it, what you can do with it. So a couple of examples of some contemplative routines that he described would be every day he sits down for a few minutes and describes his day to his wife. And he goes through everything he experienced, thought about, what happened, because this helps him think about it and piece it together rather than just try to block it all out and go on to the next. He talked about an author who, I'm not sure how frequently, but what he does is he writes long letters to friends explaining something. The act of explaining it and reflecting on it to describe it to someone else causes him to think more about it. So we talked about how we can make what we know and what we learn more applicable. And Jordan Harbinger said the example of, when you go to a conference or something, and I'm sure both you and I have experienced this, you take notes and you fill up the pages that they give you, and then you get home, that bag goes somewhere, and a few months later, you're like, yeah, I might as well just throw this away because you haven't incorporated it yet. So really just talking about how we can make our knowledge more applicable. And one of the things they talked about is that the act of thinking helps to encode the knowledge into the brain. So going back and thinking about it or thinking about it during the process helps to encode it and make it applicable in the brain. And this he described as it means that you're acting in a disfluent manner, meaning you're interrupting the flow of just picking up information. You're actually disrupting that. So disfluence and thinking about it as this happened. And the example that he used would be a study where they had college students, taking notes from a lecture on a laptop versus handwriting them. And I think everyone kind of knows this, and I know you always handwrite your notes for these episodes. But what they found is that weeks later, the students who had handwritten the notes had much more ability to recalled so much more information. Although those who took notes on the laptop could write so much more and almost could write the lecture verbatim because they could type more quickly than we can write. So the problem...
Really?
Yeah.
Gosh, I would say the opposite.
So the problem is...
Depends how quickly you type, I suppose.
Yeah. They're doing it so quickly that they can catch everything, but there's no thinking involved. When you have to handwrite, you think about, okay, I've just heard these 5 sentences. I'm going to sum that up in this way because you can't write it all down. And therefore, you've thought about it. You've processed the information. You've already started to assimilate it in your mind. And therefore, your future use of that knowledge will be more accessible.
See, so there's some method in my dinosaur ways.
That's right. But the goal would be you just listen to the episode once and get the content. Don't listen to it more than once, and don't stop and go back and stop and go back. Because in this experiment, they couldn't do that with a professor's lecture. But part of how we are able to apply knowledge is that we need that time to reflect and generate ideas of how to apply the information. And again, the idea of sharing it with someone. You and I doing this. When we listen to something we enjoy, we then share it with each other. And they describe this as, we often think this is about educating someone else. Like, oh, I have this great information, I'm going to share it with someone. But in actuality, it's more of a process of educating ourselves. It's implementing the knowledge so that we can have more access to it.
Yeah, absolutely. If you've got to explain it to somebody else, you need to understand it to explain it.
Next topic they talked about, again, kind of going back into productivity, efficiency, success. They talked about that more productive and successful organizations and people tend to perceive choices versus just seeing tasks as chores that need to get done. So our ability to motivate ourselves or others is really enhanced by looking for choices rather than just the facts, just the doing the tasks. And people who are more successful have this ability, have this time that they take to look for choices that other people might not perceive. So he goes through an example of, maybe 15 years ago or so, the Marine Corps started making training a little different here in the US. And clearly, most people know military training is very much, I tell you when to move, how to move, and when to stop moving.
Not much choice involved.
No choice involved. And they decided to change that because unfortunately, that means people aren't thinking. They're just doing what they're told. And so they started making recruits have to make choice after choice after choice. And just a simple example, often Marine recruits are 18 years old, just out of high school, still have been living at home. So what they would do is, let's say, for example, they would go to a meal, and at the end of the meal, the commander would say, okay, now you have to clean up. And the recruits would be a little surprised, and they say, okay, well, what do I do? Where are the cleaning supplies? And the commander would say, that's not my job to tell you how to do this. And, well, where do I put this? Should I put this here? Do I do this? And they wouldn't answer any of those questions. So the recruits had to make choices and make sense of things. And that made a big difference. Having a choice gives us motivation and helps us learn things better. It also does what's described as developing an internal locus of control. And we are much more successful when we have an internal locus of control. And he phrased this in another way that it really means a bias toward action. When we have that internal sense of control, we are biased toward moving forward, creating, producing, using the information that we have. An example that he shared then is a kind of mantra that people might need to come up with a mantra to motivate themselves. And this mantra basically would ask, why am I doing this? And I know this is a concept that is so talked about nowadays in the entrepreneurial space, but almost any behavior change people are trying to make is to ask, why am I doing this? And this is super important. Because, again, this helps to motivate us. He used an example of a professor who, let's say, is in microbiology or immunology, let's say. And he's teaching a class to freshmen and grading papers. So this is the most boring material for him. And the most boring task of grading these 18 and 19-year-olds' papers. He hates it. That's the part of his job he hates. So in order to get through that and be motivated to do that, what he has to do is ask himself, why am I doing this? And he has to kind of extrapolate. Well, when I do this, it means I keep this job, which allows me these research opportunities. When I conduct my research, I find things that are helping people. And when I find certain things out in my research, I'm saving people's lives. Now, it sounds like a really big stretch. Grading these papers is not saving people's lives, but he has to think of it that way. Doing this task allows me this huge opportunity to save lives.
So it kind of is.
Absolutely.
It's part
indirectly
of the process.
Yeah, absolutely. So again, most productive people are able to see that our brain is something that we can choose to manage and control rather than just feel like it happens to us. It's coming from our brain, so we have nothing to do with it. Teaching ourselves how to think is really less about what we think and more about how to think. So the other topic they then talked about is how to encourage this in other people. So far, this was a little more talked about as far as helping yourself to use knowledge and to be motivated and productive. But how can you use this with other people? And I think it's a great example for any listeners who have children. An example of kind of what I call mental rehearsal. I think he would kind of refer to more again as a contemplative routine. So if a child comes to you and says, I'm bored, rather than saying, you have no reason to be bored. There are so many things you could do. Now go find something.
Oh, yeah. How many times have we heard that?
So I went outside and picked long pieces of grass and fed it to my bike like it was a horse. But what he said is that it's better to ask them to tell you a story of what they could do. Have them use their imagination. Have them mentally rehearse, and this is the term I use, mentally rehearse the event coming up or what they want to be doing to create that map so that they then can follow through with it. He also talked about an example where your child brings home an A on a paper or in a class. And what a lot of people want to do is give a lot of positive feedback. Oh my gosh, that's great. You're awesome. I'm so proud of you that you did this. And it really highlights that it's an innate trait. You're so wonderful. See, you're so smart. I knew you could do this. And, not that that's not well-intended feedback.
I can sense the but. Yeah.
What it sets up, though, again, kind of goes back to Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset. If we think that getting an A is something about me as a person that's kind of set, then when I'm struggling, I have no reason to believe that there's something else I could do about it. So instead, just to reinforce the effort, I'm so proud of you that you worked on that project. Look what happened by putting in all of that effort. You really showed that you're learning. So just highlighting the steps and the growth involved rather than this inherent trait like, wow, you're amazing, is a helpful way to think about helping to encourage and motivate kids. And of course, if you work this doesn't just work with kids, but if you manage people at work or work in large teams, you could use these skills as well. He talked about building mental models. Again, I think this is what I would refer to as cognitive rehearsal or mental rehearsal. And there's really important information on this or research on this that shows when you teach people how to think through a crisis, they're much more able to handle the crisis. So it helps people to think, what steps would you go through? And when they're teaching people to use or to build mental models, they teach them to go through quite a bit of detail. What would you do if this happened? What would your hands do? How would you move? What would be the first step you would take to really go through the detail? So he used an example that I'm not very familiar with, but I know if I look back in history, I'm sure I will see it. I don't know how long ago it was, but it was an airplane taking off from Singapore to Australia, a Qantas flight, and I had a terrible thing happen in flight. And the team, the pilot team, the flight crew, had just been through some building mental models training that day. So thinking about what steps would you take if the engine failed? What would you do? How would you course correct? So when they listened to the recording of the discussion in the cockpit, they heard that. They heard them going through the steps. And it's such a great model of if we know the steps and build these mental models that we can repeat them. But I think he really shared this example because of another term that he wanted to share, and it's what he calls cognitive tunneling. And this is when we get so overwhelmed by the stimulus and the information coming in that we don't go through our thinking process, and instead we resort to reacting instead of thinking. And this is actually what happened in this flight. The pilot had been going through that mental model, and then the information became so overwhelming to him that he just went into responding. And he talked about examples. This doesn't have to be only if you're a pilot on a major flight, but let's say you're in a meeting with a coworker or a boss, and something happens that is just overwhelming to you. Reacting rather than thinking would be you shoot back a really quick answer that unravels everything even more. And many of us may experience this with email. We shoot that horrible email in response to something because we're, doing cognitive tunneling. We're so overwhelmed by what's going on that all we can think about is how to react.
Well, Facebook's a great example of that, isn't it?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And so again, the building of mental models, rehearse in your mind, what steps can I take here? He talked again about doing it in great detail. So I'm going to a meeting today. In that meeting, when we get to this part in the agenda, I want to ask this question because I need to know this, or I'm asking for a raise, or whatever it is. So rather than just going into it and saying, well, I hope I get to talk about my raise today, to actually mentally set it up, rehearse. When would I do that? How will I say it? That this creates so much more likelihood that we'll be able to complete the task and work toward avoiding that cognitive tunneling. So in this interview, they then went on to talk a little bit more about creativity and things, but I think that's a little bit of a different topic that they were moving toward. So I really just wanted to focus on these things today. The idea that giving ourselves some contemplative routines, giving ourselves time to think about our knowledge, think about how we're using it. It might be journaling. And he talked about the importance of this being on a regular basis. It's not like, hey, every few months I do this. But it's at least maybe a few times a week, or it's every day. It's something that you take time out to think about the knowledge and what you're going to do with it. Again, the sharing, the taking time to think during the process, motivating ourselves and others by focusing on choices rather than just the tasks. And then working on this mental models so that we are less likely to fall into the trap of cognitive tunneling.
I can remember Vishen Lakhiani talking about this sort of thinking, contemplative routines, thinking about your day, taking some time out every morning. I think he was talking about, morning routines and the different things that he suggested were a good thing to be part of that. But I remember part of it was sort of imagining your day and planning out your day and, just contemplating for a while the tasks that you had to do and how you might go about them in the framework of being more productive. So yes, that makes sense. And a lot of things you were talking about absorbing information and really trying to get that to take hold in your brain. I mean, they're those sort of old revision techniques, aren't they, about how you listen to something and you take notes and then you leave them for a bit and you come back to those notes and you summarize them and you take it down to just a few bullet points that you should then be able to take that brief page of notes, those bullet points, and be able to extrapolate out to explain that to somebody else, which is kind of what we do here. And sometimes, pointing at myself here, struggle with that a bit, struggle with the condensing it down enough into those bullet points. Really should be able to just have that page of bullet point notes that I can then expand back out to talk to you. So I think it's definitely a skill that needs working on, that we need to practice. And yes, so I like the idea of incorporating it much more in your daily routine with all kind of things that you do to just make it something easier to do. And the other thing that I like that I've certainly put into practice is that imagining how you would deal with something, how you would deal with a problem. I can remember, my mother always said to me, well, think about if I was worried about something that was coming up. She would encourage me to think about the worst thing that could happen. And how would you deal with that? What would be the steps that you would take if the worst thing happens? What would be the steps if the best thing happens, or anything in between? Because once you've got that plan, and we've had episodes, haven't we, where you can build that muscle memory just by thinking about something. But I really like it in the example of extrapolating your why for something, why you're doing something, and making why you're doing something a choice. So I've always said to people when they're talking about why they have started taking a ketogenic approach, for example, to the way they eat. Well, thinking about your goals. What are your goals? What's your why? We've all heard these terms. But something really sort of loosey-goosey, like, well, I want to lose weight. It's so airy-fairy that you can't really grab hold of it. But if you really sit down and think about it and extrapolate it out, well, okay, yes, losing weight might be your biggest why, but why is losing weight? What are the details there? What are the images that come up? Whatever it is, maybe it's, being able to run around with your kids or keep up with your dogs or walk to the shops and back without your knees creaking. Whatever it is, keep building the details, building and building and building until you've got this really strong image. Because I think a lot of us work very well with images when we've got an image in our head of something. And then that's a really good reminder when we're struggling. But it also means, we're choosing. Everything's a choice in what we do. But it's a good motivator to have in your head, to have this really strong image of why you're doing something, but that you are making a choice to head towards that particular goal.
Absolutely. I remember Marissa Peer used this example, and I've shared it in many places, but she talked about when she was writing her first book, and everyone else in her family was in bed, and she was still sitting at the computer typing away. And she was resentful at first. It was easy to say, this sucks. Here I am, uncomfortable, sitting here at 1 o'clock in the morning doing this while they're all sleeping comfortably. And it was hard to work that way because you're resenting it, you're dreading it, you're just seeing it as a burden or a task that you have to do. And so she had to purposely think about what's going to happen when my book is published and thousands of people are buying my book and it becomes a top seller and people change their lives because of what information I'm sharing. Well, then sitting there at 1 a.m. alone typing became very doable. Just by changing.
Or certainly more doable.
Yeah. Just by changing.
Because it's not to say that it's miraculously, like with a magic wand, is going to stop these tasks being onerous, but it's going to make it that bit easier to deal with them.
And I think that's such an important concept for all of us. And we've talked about this. I talk about this a lot in my work. A lot of times the things that we need to do for our health, our weight, our career, our relationships, they involve tasks that we don't really like doing. They involve things that are a bit uncomfortable. They involve change, which is uncomfortable. And the more we can be really connected to this discomfort is worth it because
it's a choice.
Yeah, it's a choice and it's taking me somewhere that I want to be and I can imagine being there. So really using those mental models, or as I refer to it as the mental rehearsal, seeing it. If you want to lose weight, see yourself walking into that store where you can buy the size clothes that you want to be wearing. And what a lot of us keep doing is we keep envisioning, we keep seeing what's already here. I hate how I feel in my clothes. I hate going into that store. I hate having to buy that size. I hate being stuck in that job. I hate my role, versus envisioning the role you want, envisioning being in your job in a way that feels good to you, because that will help you create that more. And as you already touched on, and I've probably said this in here 1,000 times, our brain doesn't know the difference between a mental rehearsal and a fact. Same, it doesn't know the difference between a mentally rehearsed bad thing versus fact either. And so when we play too much of the what if game in a negative vein, yeah, but what if this happens? And then what if this happens? And what if this? And we just keep rehearsing all of how it's just going to go horribly, versus, like you said, picture, okay, what if it doesn't go exactly as I planned? What if the less favorable thing does happen? How will I recover from that? If I am doing my piano recital and a page of the music falls off the piano, what will I do? Rather than getting stuck in the fear of it happening, give yourself the out. How will I handle it? Because that could happen. And I don't need to be so thrown off by it, because we tend to catastrophize things. Obviously, I could talk about this for a long time. It's just, I think these are really key things. And he just kind of described them in some different ways than I've thought of them before. So I really enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, and I think it's worth remembering sometimes when we did work really hard to get something we wanted and we've forgotten that struggle. You know, think how difficult it was, I would say, for 99% of people to learn how to drive. You know, I was very, very highly motivated to learn how to drive. You know, I used to live out in the middle of nowhere, and it was my ticket to freedom. You know, a car would mean, and because I had to get a train backwards and forwards to school, it was at that time, it probably isn't the case now, but at that time, it was cheaper for my parents to get me a car and pay for the insurance and things than it was to pay for the train tickets. So I was highly motivated to pass that test first time, but it was much harder than I was expecting it to be. And it took a lot of work and a lot of frustration, but I got there, and now it's, you know, it's second nature and it's something I take for granted. But I remind myself sometimes of that, just that sometimes overwhelming frustration, like I'm never going to be able to do this. This is so much harder than I thought it was going to be. But I did, and now I can do it.
Absolutely. So hopefully listeners can take some of these tools, these thoughts from this episode, and work on their own motivation, their why, creating their own effective mental models, and using that idea of contemplative routines, giving yourself time each day or a couple times a week to really reflect on what you're learning, what you're thinking, what you're experiencing, and how you're going to use it. Not ruminating with it. And I think that's a really important distinction. A lot of us can do a lot of thinking that goes nowhere. And this is not what he's describing. He's really talking about, wow, I've seen these things today. I've learned this. I'm doing this. Here's what this means for the future. Here's how I'll use this information. Absolutely.
Well, Terri, I hope you have a very wonderful week. And everyone at home.
Thanks, Daisy. I hope you do as well. Take good care, everybody.